All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Mohammed Kazarunian, and I am joined by Jackson Meisner in the
Hello.
episode of our new podcast, A Winter of Discontent. In this podcast series, we set out to explain and analyze the major trends, ideas, and changes that have contributed to America's contemporary political, social, and cultural crisis. But before we begin, we should introduce ourselves. So, I'm Mohammed Kazarian, as I mentioned earlier. I'm a young 23-year-old guy who is interested in history, politics, and econ. And I know you're thinking right now, oh boy, why did I hop onto this podcast listening to
You
some...
you forgot to mention long walks on the beach and deep
Oh, right.
talks as well.
There's also a picture of me with a fish I'm holding up.
Uh-huh.
Right. But jokes aside, I am a super nerd who just loves to read about history and politics. And I hope to bring some of that enthusiasm to this podcast.
Right. Well, I'm Jackson Meisner, and I think a lot of what was said about Muhammad would also apply to me. I mean, I'm 23 years old as well. I'm international relations graduate, although I've always had a personal passion for political theory and political science, even though I didn't, get a degree in that. But still, I think it's important to talk about either way, especially because I don't think that you can understand a lot of the things that are happening in the world without getting a good understanding of the individual political actors doing them. So I'm really excited to do this podcast with Muhammad, where we can hopefully explore some of those people and those actors.
As am I. I should also mention I am an econ major with a BA. I should have mentioned that earlier. So at least I have some kind of credential.
So actually, you're listening to a podcast about political theory, political science from two people who didn't study it.
Exactly.
So, that actually makes us distinct from most of the other podcasts that do basically the exact same thing.
Right. But you can trust us.
Exactly. Because we're not the establishment.
Indeed, we are not. All right, then. So what are we all about? What is the purpose of our podcast? Well, it is clear to most Americans and to us that our country is in, well, how could we say it, a period of discontent, and that change is sorely needed. But we wonder, why is our country in such bad shape? Every day we can look at the news and learn about the most recent upsetting headline, the most recent clash in the culture war, the latest scandal, the latest foreign war, the latest foretelling of doom. But how can we make sense of all this news and information? What are the long-term forces driving these everyday incidents? How can we zoom out of the daily news cycle and get a bird's eye view of it all? How can we understand the long-term changes? If this sort of perspective sounds appealing, then this is the podcast for you. Our podcast will investigate the many potential political, social, cultural, and economic forces that are shaping our present American crisis. We will explore the effects of globalization, the rise of secular life, the different strands of right-wing populism, the intellectual underpinnings of anti-establishment sentiment on both the left and right, the origins and rise of political polarization, and many, many other topics. We will explain and analyze competing theories of our world and invite speakers to defend and debate these ideas. We will reference and analyze important texts and speeches to give added rigor to our analysis. Our podcast will try to use a discussion-based format for the most part, although Jackson and I will hold unscripted conversations which are only structured by the general topics and key points that we want to discuss. Ultimately, we hope to educate our countrymen and ourselves in the complex forces changing our country. We want to avoid becoming bogged down in the sensational news cycles of our time. Our consumption of their theatrics impoverishes and slants our worldviews. But we believe that fresh, honest, and good faith investigations into the strands that make up the big picture can help us out of this rut. And with that, we can turn to the topic of our first episode.
All right. So our first episode is going to be a general sort of overview of the different strands of the ideology that's probably been the most influential in the last decade or so, which is like right-wing populism. So to start with, we're just going to go over the various like factions of right-wing populists that have been kind of like moving the present political moment, what they believe, how they relate to each other, a little bit on who some of the thinkers are. But the plan for our podcast is we're going to do an individual episode on each of the strands that we mention. So we might be talking about them a little in passing today, but if you're kind of like, oh, I wish they went into more detail about like this group, well, don't worry. We're going to have much more detailed overviews in their individual episodes, but right now we just kind of want to give a general overview. And I think to start off with, before we kind of discuss the populists, we have to discuss, who's the establishment that they dislike. I'm going to guess that most of the people listening to our podcast are going to be on the younger side. And so, you probably, if you're like me, you came up in a time where right-wing populism as like the governing faction of the Republican Party was kind of dominant. I mean, I was in middle school. I'm pretty sure you were also in middle school, Muhammad, when Trump won in 2016. If
Right.
we're the same age. Yeah, but Trumpism appeared to come out of nowhere, and that's because the establishment wing of the Republican Party, which is in somewhat disarray now, for a very long time seemed like the sort of stable center of the Republican Party. And that sort of worldview, political scientists will often refer to it as fusionist. And the reason is because it is a fusion of free market economics and like social conservatism. You can think of people like Mitt Romney, Paul Ryan, both Bushes, and Ronald Reagan really as sort of like big avatars of this sort of belief or this sort of worldview. So we're talking, very Atlanticist when it comes to foreign policy, a big focus on preserving American dominance in the world and preserving American relationships with our traditional allies in Europe and East Asia, a very big focus on countering like China and Russia, a focus on cutting taxes and cutting regulations in the domestic sphere, and also, generally speaking, more moderate cultural conservatism. But they definitely begin to sort of fall out later, sort of in the 2010s, especially compared to some of these other groups that we're going to be talking about.
Yeah, I think, Jackson, you gave a great overview of the general consensus of the underpinning the whole Republican Party, this fusionism of free market economics, social conservatism, and internationalist foreign policy. But maybe looking a little bit deeper, we can see that there are still competing factions at this point. The first one we could say is the most dominant sort of subfaction, which are maybe people would call neoconservative, moderate Republicans, or just fusionists. And these are the people that most explicitly adhere to these sort of to that fusionist consensus that we said earlier. And I don't think that needs much of a discussion to talk about. But then there are other factions as well. One of them is the Christian right, and we saw them gain a lot of prominence in the 1980s and throughout the whole period of pre-2015 Republican consensus. They were an integral part of the coalition. Yeah, maybe Jackson, if you have anything to say about the other factions.
Yeah, I mean, the Christian religious right is interesting because you can sort of think of these factions as the neoconservatives, the fusionists, the moderate Republicans very much represent the heads of the party. And before 2015, you can really say they rely on some of the other smaller factions for support, and to turn out for them during the elections, but they're also very much sort of kept out of the limelight. They're given policy, wins every now and again, like the right will be anti-abortion in order to sort of throw a bone to the Christian right. But these factions are very much kind of kept out of the limelight or out of any actual position of power. Other factions, other than the Christian right, include like this libertarian wing of the party or a very like constitutionalist wing of the party.
Right.
You can see like people like Ron Paul and Rand Paul are like very good examples of this wing. They had a big moment in 2012 with the Tea Party, which was very much sort of like a libertarian tinged movement.
We'll talk about that more later.
Yeah, exactly. There is a separate libertarian party, of course, but these guys are also tend to be more socially conservative, so they've stayed in the Republican Party. You also have a very interesting sort of nativist paleoconservative wing, and we're going to get into paleoconservatism later. And they're a whole interesting faction in of themselves, but these are sort of your farther right types, like your Pat Buchanan's. I guess there aren't really that many prominent paleoconservatives before the sort of like Trump era, but
Right.
they've always represented traditionally the really more sort of farther right wing of the Republican Party. You
Right.
know, the part that's a lot more skeptical of immigration, the part that's really, really focused on the culture war. And they do sort of merge in with some of the other factions like the Christian right. And they're also suspicious of big government in a very similar way to like the libertarians, but they do sort of represent a more hardline faction.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I think to wrap this up on the pre-2015 Republicans, we have to understand there are these Christian right members, nativists, libertarian conservatives, but ultimately they're adhering to this fusionist free market economic social conservative sort of hybrid. So you'll see in elections, Republican candidates will probably talk about tax cuts, stronger foreign intervention, and maybe restrictions on abortion and things like that. Those are sort of like common issues that will come up a lot. So, scaling government size back a little more social conservatism and stronger American interventionism, hard power abroad. But I think now we should probably turn to what happened after 2008, what led to this consensus shattering and the vacuum that emerged that created the right-wing populist discussion for today.
Yeah, I think you sort of see the establishment really start to lose power after the 2008 recession. That's a big moment that people are that was the big moment that really radicalized a lot of people, I think, across the
Right,
political spectrum, but especially on the right.
right.
And so you start to see the sort of the old fusionist way of sort of managing these different sub factions really begins to break down during this period, because each of these factions start to get their own grievances with what they consider to be the establishment leadership, which sort of sets them up to eventually become, like the followers of an anti-establishment movement or the
Mhm.
progenitors of an anti-establishment movement. Um, do you? I would say, like, Mama, do you want to talk a little bit about like some of the specific like grievances that begin around this time with the establishment post 2008?
Right. Yeah. I think also to add on to what you were saying, the 2008 recession and Obama's election to the presidency really breaks Republican base confidence in their leadership. Obama was able to pass Obamacare, March stimulus support, et cetera, big government acts basically. And the Republican base feels that the leadership has left them behind and isn't trying to stop these, what they say, big government actions. And they become increasingly frustrated by what they believe are their leaders abandoning them. And they start to gravitate more towards other grievances that have been long simmering, backlashes to immigration, globalization, and other like liberal progressive ideas. And so I think from there we can start to understand the new grievances that are going to be the animus behind all of these right-wing populist groups we'll talk about. I think the first one that's most important, arguably, is a focus on national sovereignty. We could also call this focus on national conservatism. And this is the belief that the national interest has been sold out by the elites. They believe that the elites are not caring about America's interest when it comes to immigration. There's too many immigrants coming in. They believe that there's too much multiculturalism, too much globalism, as they might call it, et cetera. And they also believe in the economic realm that free trade and deindustrialization are weakening American national sovereignty and American interests.
Yeah, there definitely is a big focus on this idea that like the establishment isn't doing enough to stop Democrats from selling out America's national interests. I think like the Benghazi thing is a really good example of this. The sort of, I think, fact that that issue had so much salience, and the fact that a lot of like people in the conservative movement were accusing Republicans in Congress of not doing enough about it. Which, if you then compare that to the amount of hours spent on Benghazi related inquiries, definitely sounds kind of funny in retrospect. In fact, you could even imagine them hauling Hillary Clinton in today to still ask her about it. But
Mhm.
it definitely, you start to see also a lot of anger at free trade agreements, which is
Mhm.
interesting because this had been a like dispute among the right for quite some time, even dating back to the 1990s. And you do have candidates like Ross Perot in the 90s who attracts a lot of right wingers because he runs on a platform of opposition to NAFTA and opposition to free trade. But there
Mm.
very much is this growing sense around this time that Republicans and Democrats are sort of part of a uniparty establishment that are selling Americans out on free trade, and that something needs to happen in order to sort of re-emphasize the national interests and a bigger focus on economic nationalism and putting America first economically.
No, definitely. I think, Jackson, you made a good point, focusing on how free trade was one of the big sticking points that led a lot of people to think the national interest being sold out. They think a lot of Republicans started to see these, closed down industrial plants throughout the country, especially in the Rust Belt region, and started to think maybe these free trade policies are destroying our nation. They're leading to job losses, economic hardship, drug use, etc. And if we start using this sort of national sovereignty sort of framing, we can start to see what all of the lineup between the different a lot of the different grievances. So the opposition to globalism and multiculturalism, opposition to immigration, etc. All of these things kind of all are seen as schemes, perhaps, to undermine the nation, whether economically or socially. And I mean, speaking of socially, I think that gets the second main grievance after national sovereignty that animates most right-wing populists, opposition to social liberalism. I think maybe, Jackson, you have a lot to say about that.
Yeah, I mean, there's the election of Obama was meaningful in like a lot of different ways to a lot of different people. For liberals, this was the first black president and really a symbol of
Mhm.
how far America had progressed on racial
Mm.
issues. And for a lot of conservatives, it was a sign of how far they thought America had strayed from what it was supposed to be or what
Mm.
its original intent should have been. And you sort of see this frustration grow and grow over the course of the Obama administration, particularly with things like affirmative action, gay marriage, sort of the increased presence of like LGBTQ people in public life,
Mm.
and transgender issues towards the tail end of the Obama administration. And there's, again, sort of similar to the foreign policy thing, a belief that the Republican establishment isn't pushing hard enough to stop these things.
Right.
Increasingly, conservatives start to complain that essentially the Republican establishment just seems like liberals of like 10 or 15 years ago, and that all they're
Mm.
doing is just slowing down the cultural changes, that they're not actually trying to reverse them. So you start to see a much bigger emphasis among the Republican base of we need somebody who's going to come in and not just try to, stop the train from moving, but actually do like roll back on cultural progressivism.
Right. And I think that rollback can kind of be understood as the reculmination of a culture war that, according to many, had been going on since the 1960s. I mean, perhaps for many Americans, the most famous moment was Ross Perot's speech at the Republican National Convention in 92, where he starts talking about how like culture war between liberal progressivism and traditional conservatism is the defining feature of American politics. And for a lot of Republicans, the new social liberal advancements that Jackson mentioned, adoption of gay marriage, perhaps more racial equality, maybe greater LGBT rights, etc., are seen as, new shots fired basically in the culture war. And the culture war that seemed to maybe get on the down low a little bit after the 90s is really going to heat back up in the mid 2010s because of this. And as Jackson said, there is a suspicion that GOP elites are not doing much to really stop this. They seem to go along with a lot of this. And I think that suspicion that actually is part of the third major grievance that I think a lot of Republicans and right wingers will have, which is a sort of anti-establishment populism that emerges. That's the third major theme of right wing populism.
Yeah, the populism can almost be seen as a result of their prior dissatisfaction or sort of a product of it. There's this, as we mentioned, this increasing belief in all these different sections that the Republican elite are essentially rhinos, which stands for Republican in name only,
Mhm.
that essentially they're basically just soft versions of liberals, or even if they are conservatives, they're not strong enough to, do what needs to be done in order to institute conservative values or preserve the country. And there's a varying sort of sliding scale of how conspiratorial you can be when it comes to this belief, from people just saying, oh, well, the Republicans elites are just like soft, or they kind of want to keep their jobs rather than win elections,
Mhm.
to sort of more lurid accusation that there's a secret uniparty or a deep state that controls Washington, D.C. and locks real Americans out of making real change. But it generally leads to this common feeling, no matter what part of that you believe, that real Americans and real conservatives are getting sold out. And so this creates an increasingly kind of Manichaean view on the Republican Party, that essentially you're either with us, you're with the people, you're with the movement, or you're with them, you're with the establishment.
You're with
And
us or the
anyone who tells
terrorists.
you, anyone who tells you that things are going too far, that maybe we should slow down, clearly just isn't dedicated enough or isn't taking this seriously.
No, exactly. This sort of populism isn't necessarily new in American history. There have been moments of populism before, perhaps seen in the 60s and early 70s with maybe pro-segregation figures, or you can go back earlier, the New Deal, etc. But this sort of populism is going to be unique in that it believes that the current Republican Party establishment isn't doing the bidding of the base. And they're increasingly a litmus test is going to start showing up with amongst many members of the Republican Party and conservatives, where they want to see whether or not if you want to trust a leader, basically, you want to see, are you actually going to support us, or are you in with the consultants and campaigners in the Washington Beltway, right? Like, this becomes the ultimate question or test for any future Republican leader. Are you actually authentic? Are you sincere? Or are you going to keep on lying to us? Um,
Yeah. Yeah, and that leads into increasingly perverse incentives for Republican electoral officials, because as the base is becoming more radical and as they're accepting compromise less and less, you're sort of encouraged to go along with it and sort of feed into
mhm.
that attitude instead of confronting it. I think an excellent example of just how much things have changed is there's a video during the 2008 election of a John McCain rally, and a woman gets up in the
Mhm.
crowd and tells John McCain the conspiracy theory that Barack Obama is a secret Muslim who's out to
Mhm.
destroy America. And McCain shuts her down. He actually stops her talking and tells her that that he understands her concerns about Obama, but that he thinks that's not true and that Obama is just a good man who happens to have a different belief from the average American. And then you can contrast that with the number of ways that Republican politicians in the present have acted when it comes to President Trump's increasingly lurid attacks on all of his political opponents, which is essentially to react with glee or just to not mention it at all.
Right. Now we have an increasingly energized Republican base or conservative base that not only sees their own party's leadership as working against them, but also the country's leadership at large. And they feel that their interests are incompatible with their own interests. And I think with that, we kind of see the three main grievances that have now emerged within the Republican Party and amongst the American right: national sovereignty being undermined, liberal progressivism undermining conservative values, and populist and anti-establishment views becoming popular as the base feels their interests have been sold out. And I think with that, Jackson, we can probably turn to this new factions of right-wing populism that make up the modern GOP, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And these factions are interesting because they resemble a lot sort of the factions that we mentioned earlier, the sort of subgroups of the old sort of Republican Party that had been, in a relationship with the establishment where, they got some political wins in exchange for supporting establishment candidates. But now these groups are increasingly vocal on their own. And so, um, Mohammed, I think you're definitely the person to talk about right libertarianism, because I think you're the one who knows more about it compared to the two of us.
Right. Yeah. So the first faction that I think should be mentioned is what we call right libertarianism. And that's probably not the name that most of these people who adhere to this ideology would call themselves, but that's what we're going to call them in a more academic sense. And this is first on our list because this is really the first major populist movement post 2008 amongst the American right. And we kind of mentioned a little earlier how there was a lot of dissatisfaction starting with the response to 2008, big government, Obamacare, etc. And this sort of animus is being angry at the Republican establishment failure to stop Obama's expansion of government leads to this movement called the Tea Party, which you may have heard of. And this is really the biggest, most prominent sort of right libertarian populist sort of movement. And the Tea Party is really a movement that is trying to hold is a like a grassroots movement with millions of members that is trying to hold the GOP leadership accountable as they see it. They think that they aren't stopping Obama's agenda. They don't think they are doing enough to protect constitutional values and rights, and they aren't doing enough to protect the free market. And you're going to see a lot of prominent people, Ron Paul, Sarah Palin, even Paul Ryan to an extent. Many of these people are associated with this Tea Party, and they become prominent in 2010s. They get elected, especially in the 2010 midterms, which is a big watershed moment where many Tea Party candidates get elected. And they'll have a lot to say and have a lot of control over congressional agenda for the next few years.
Yeah, it's definitely interesting because you could sort of see of the factions we're going to discuss, this is definitely sort of the elder one when it comes to populism because, they do gain prominence immediately post 2008 and definitely more in the pre-Trump era. Like if you went back to like 2013 and you asked people to describe like who's kind of the most right-wing Republicans in Congress, they would describe members of the Tea Party who are mostly aligned with the right libertarian faction. And of course, in the Trump era and sort of in the present, they've lost out a little bit on influence within the Republican Party compared to some of these other factions who we're going to talk about, and definitely compared to Trump himself, who has always been somewhat ambivalent about libertarianism as a political movement. And the libertarians have also been rather ambivalent about him as a political figure.
Right.
But they definitely still do have influence in the present day. I mean, the Freedom Caucus, which was sort of the group that was of congressmen who were created after the big 2010 midterm sweep for the Republicans, they're still around in Congress and they still have a lot of members to this day, even if increasingly a lot of those members are more aligned with Trumpism than traditional right libertarianism.
Right. I think maybe we could go a little more in detail into some of the specific issues that animate them. So we mentioned, these folks are focused on, opposing big government. So they're for small government. They're a lot like traditional American conservatives, pro-free market. They want less government regulation. They believe the government is regulating too much. They're opposed to what they believe are usurpations of civil liberties that have been going on, especially since the War on Terror and the Patriot Act. They believe that not only is the government conspiring to take their rights, but the government is in bed with corporations and big business to do that. And we would also say they have strong pro-constitutional values. They believe that America has strayed too far from the founding principles of the Constitution. And to fix America, we need to get closer to those founding values. We need to stick closer to the Constitution.
Yeah, exactly. There's this big focus on the importance of constitutionalism. Definitely, we mentioned that this is the right libertarians. Like traditionally, they're among the libertarian movement in general. There's been, debates on what libertarian opinions on social policies can be. The ones within the Republican parties are definitely culturally right wing in a way
Right.
that perhaps the broader libertarian movement isn't.
Right.
Particularly anti LGBT, tends to be more in favor of restrictions on abortion. Definitely very, very pro Second Amendment, although this is also true of the broader libertarian movement in general.
Yeah, no. And I think that kind of rounds out right libertarianism. Maybe we should mention they're also fiercely opposed to the Patriot Act, government surveillance. They want to shrink the welfare state, or what they call welfare warfare state, and are generally isolationists and believe in lower taxes. And I think with that, maybe we can turn to the big break in right-wing thinking in America, the shift towards national conservatism or even nativism.
Yeah, so the National Conservatives are a very, very interesting faction. They're definitely new on the scene, although national conservatism as an ideology has been around for some time. But as a political
Mhm.
force in America, they really are a sort of Trump adjacent movement in the sense that they sort of grew in prominence alongside MAGA. And as we'll talk about later in the podcast, there is sort of a debate over how different MAGA and national conservatism really are. So I guess for the sake of this podcast, we're going to sort of say that MAGA is a bit more of sort of a, I guess, like vibes-based movement, for lack of a better term, whereas national conservatism tends
We
to
love the vibes.
we love the vibes. It's wonderful what they're doing. But national conservatives, they tend to at least be a little more coherent when it comes to their ideology and their worldview. Just a very quick overview of what that worldview actually is. National conservatism, as the name implies, is very much focused on the nation as sort of the sole um, basis for how the country should be run, focusing on the national interest, which is a term that gets used a lot by national conservatives. And there is this sort of belief that there is a single nation that is inhabited by a single people with a single culture, and that they have a single interest together. It's a lot less pluralist than a lot of these sort of Republican traditions that came before it, which
Mhm.
emphasize federalism and like decentralization and sort of more like letting people do as they please within sort of a broadly American values framework.
Right. No, I think Jackson did a good job describing how big of a shift this is from the individualist sort of traditional American conservative viewpoint towards a framework focused on how the national culture, ethnic group, and beliefs can be upheld. And I think we can see a few major figures that might be good to point out. The Vice President, J.D. Vance, is often described as a national conservative. The senator from Missouri, Hawley, is also considered a national conservative. And I think on the relationship between MAGA and national conservatism, I will argue, maybe perhaps a little differently from Jackson, that this national conservative worldview, that the national interest or sovereignty is under threat from globalist forces from abroad, like immigration and multiculturalism, and from cultural progressivism and liberalism, destroying the national culture from within. I'm going to argue that the MAGA movement is in large part like a national conservative movement, but just with a right wing populist style. But we will definitely discuss what exactly the relationship between these two are later on.
Yeah, I think you mentioned earlier this sort of focus on like a single nation. Particularly, you mentioned Vice President Vance, and he's a very, very important figure in the national conservative movement, particularly because he really does articulate the increasing lean among national conservatives towards a very different conception of American nationalism and sort of what it means to be an American. Traditionally, both like the Democrats and the Republicans have endorsed, at least since the 1960s, really a version of Americanism that's based on like values. The idea that anyone can come to the United States, and if you just accept certain values, you can be an American just like anyone else. But J.D. Vance and has stated in speeches that he considers the relationship between American citizenship and really being American to be a lot less linked. In fact, he says, there are certain people with roots in this country
Mhm.
who are perhaps more American than other people who are recent arrivals, even though they might both be citizens. Sort of, citizenship is a piece of paper, but Americanness is something that flows through blood.
The so-called heritage Americans, right?
Yeah, the heritage American thing, which is a very, very different conception compared to what had previously been thought of. It's a very European conception of nationality as being related to ethnicity rather than there
Mhm.
being a separation between the two.
Right. And I think maybe it would be useful to mention a few specific policy points to show what national conservatives actually think in practice. So they're talking a lot about the national interest and national sovereignty, but what does that mean? So in economic terms, they would call them economic nationalists. They are suspicious of free markets and capitalism because they think that the market, works in the interest of profits and, making some people wealthy, but not necessarily in the interest of the nation or the state. Like they would point to free trade and globalization as eroding national barriers, national borders, and national industries. Offshoring, manufacturing or industry to foreign countries because it's cheaper there. So that's why they would criticize free market capitalism. And they're more economically centrist. In fact, maybe even close to the Democrats on economic issues. Some of them advocated for like paid family leave and things like that are quite interventionist. On the social side of things, they think that liberal progressive ideology is a threat to the nation's culture and traditions. They believe that liberal progressivism is an attack on American Christianity, a sense of national identity, and traditional American culture. And they're definitely strong opponents of what we call like woke progressivism.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point. One could point out that most of the factions we're going to talk about are also against, the cultural progressivism or cultural liberalism. But I think the thing that's really interesting about NatCons, particularly when it comes to this, is their willingness to use sort of state intervention to combat what they believe are excesses in cultural liberalism. So you'll see like the Trump administration is going like really, really hard to eliminate DEI policies, not just in the federal government, but also in universities and in private corporations, which is a use of state power that a lot of Republicans, even like a lot of conservative Republicans, might not have been okay with historically, which I think does show the sort of like deviation from traditional conservatism that national conservatism represents.
Right, that focus on a more centralized government, stronger state power, as opposed to traditional American federalism for sure. And I think maybe there we can start talking next about the biggest faction of right-wing populism we call the MAGA movement, or the Make America Great Again movement, or the America First movement, which I think we could start off by saying it might be useful to understand them as a hybrid of national conservative, populist, and leftover pre-2015 like fusionist politics, but that ultimately it does represent a turn towards national conservatism and nativism in the GOP.
Yeah, and we've of course expressed mild disagreement with each other over the exact relationship
Right.
between national conservatism and MAGA, but it is undeniable that there absolutely is one. And the worldview of MAGA is very similar to national conservatism in a lot of ways. Particularly this belief that sort of American interests and sovereignty are under threat from liberal elites, which is an idea that both national conservatives and MAGA really do share. So they would sort of say that like your average American is being taken advantage of by unfair forces who are manipulating the American system to give results to groups that they like and punish groups that they don't. That basically the system has become unfair and that hard work doesn't get you what it used to anymore. And there are, of course, debates over whether these concerns are like racialized or not, or whether they're mostly economic. And in our episode on MAGA, we'll get more into that. But generally speaking, if you ask MAGA people on their own terms, fairness and the fact that they believe that like certain people are being given more than they deserve or sort of cutting the line, so to speak, that's a really big idea.
Right. No, I think maybe to touch off on the worldview, there's this belief that elites, and not just like economic elites or the elites of the Democratic Party, but also in their own party, have undermined the average person's interests, and that pushing globalist, anti-national sovereignty sort of perspectives like free trade, pushing cultural liberalism, etc., are all undermining what is actually good for Americans. And I think from there we can start to look at specific policy issues. With the economics, I think we could start with is MAGA movement is not necessarily a free market movement like the pre-2015 Republican Party was, although they will continue with a lot of pro-business, pro-free market policies for sure. Like we do see deregulation, we do see tax cuts for sure, but they're increasingly a turn towards economic nationalism. As we said earlier with the NatCons, They believe that free trade and globalization undermine manufacturing and industry at home, and they're strong proponents of tariffs and other forms of protectionism and blocking immigration because they believe that that undermines wages at home.
Yeah, that's definitely the anti-immigration thing is a very, very, very big driving
Right,
sentiment
right.
among MAGA in general, and that sort of also goes into a bit on their beliefs on foreign policy, where they do believe that just like how progressive elites inside the country have taken advantage of Americans, foreign elites outside the countries or globalist elites are also taking advantage of Americans.
Mm,
Like America's gotten duped into, just letting in anyone who comes to our borders, like seeking asylum, and there are these legal immigrants coming over, and these other countries aren't doing anything about it. Or as like President Trump will insist, they're actually like Mexico is actually sending people to the United States.
in caravans.
Exactly that or they're Haitians coming in, they're eating dogs, and
Hmm.
in Springfield, and just a general belief that foreigners are coming to rip off Americans, both coming into the country and also like in terms of foreign business deals, international organizations, which is why
Right.
MAGA traditionally gets described as an isolationist movement.
Yeah. And I think we can then turn to, lastly, on social issues. They are strongly conservative, and they're, but not just strongly conservative, as much as they are conservative, they're anti-progressive, and
Mhm.
they believe they're fighting the culture war, as we mentioned earlier, that's been going on for a while, and believe that woke progressive politics are undermining America. So they oppose DEI initiatives, they oppose affirmative action, they oppose reparations. They oppose transgender, surgeries. They oppose other LGBT rights, etc. So that's maybe the last big policy item for many MAGA supporters.
Exactly. Well, Muhammad, that actually secretly they're doing transgender surgeries on celebrities. So
Oh yeah, the transvestigation. We got to keep.
Sydney Sweeney's actually secretly
Mhm.
a secret man, and
Well,
they're
we're gonna
trying to
start a
trace
new
all.
right. We're gonna start a new podcast series, the Transvestigation podcast series.
Exactly. This is going to be a sub series. We're
Mhm.
going to get that Peter. We're going to get that Peter Thiel money, and we're going to open a sub
Mhm.
series of transvestigations.
Exactly.
Uh, but moving on to, I think, the big thing that you could say really does differentiate, and not necessarily differentiate so much as the emphasis on this makes them a little different from national conservatisms, but the
Mhm.
anti-elitism is a really big thing with
Right.
MAGA. I mean, they are a populist movement like par excellence. Like this really is, if you had to focus on what is a core of MAGA, it is a belief that like they, being the elites, are out to get you, meaning the common people. This again goes back to the focus on fairness. The belief that you used to be able to work hard in America. If you put in the hours, you would get the rewards. But now increasingly, these elites don't respect the common person anymore. They're doing all these crazy cultural policies that are
Mhm.
getting rid of the culture that They're doing all this crazy stuff, and they're using it to trick you and to put you down.
Mhm.
And this colors a lot of the way that they view even other Americans. There's a big sort of
Mhm.
distrust of city elites and just people living in cities in general. This is part of a longer American political tradition, and definitely touches on earlier sort of like agrarian or like rural beliefs. But this belief that people in cities aren't quite as American as everyone else. Too many foreigners, too many certain types of people in cities, perhaps.
The MAGA people try to push back on that one, but perhaps.
Yeah, perhaps. Yeah, but just a general valorization of sort of the working class, which when they say working class always has a very specific connotation of sort of, a factory worker in like rural Ohio, wiping the sweat from his brow, standing at a
Mhm.
machine,
The little guys
while,
will get
his
it.
wife and kids are at home eagerly awaiting his return from the factory, which is somehow using like 1950 style
Mm.
manufacturing instead of automated factories, which is how all those factories actually function these days. But that's not important.
Right.
It goes against the fantasy.
Right. I think adding on to the views of American classes, not only is there a distrust of city elites, but a distrust of college educated individuals. There's an
Hmm.
anti-intellectualism belief that educated college educated people have been, they've been running America. They fill up all the top positions, doctors, lawyers, computer scientists, government officials, big business, etc. And they believe that they're ripping the average American off. The guy who works at a factory or works in a what they would call a normal job that isn't a computer job. So there's a sort of like class element, a suspicion of I guess we call it professional managerial class by the working class. And I think from there, maybe we could talk a bit about the different unique characteristics of the MAGA movement.
Hmm. Yeah, MAGA does have a lot of unique peculiarities because it is very, very tied to, the peculiar personality of a specific person, that person being Donald Trump. And so a
Mm,
lot of sort of, because it is a very personally focused movement and very based around Donald Trump as a person's personality, they kind of inherit a lot of Trump's personal beliefs towards certain
mhm,
things and a lot of his fixations. So one big thing is sort of disdain for party operators, and the sort of distrust of the Republican Party, even though they do support Republican candidates and like consistently vote for them. This
mhm.
then sort of goes back to the personalist aspects of the movement, which is
Right.
very much tied to Donald Trump. A lot of people, a lot of MAGA voters had previously voted Democrat or had previously not voted at all or had not really been engaged. And it was sort of the figure of Donald Trump that really, really motivated them to get into MAGA as a political movement. So to a lot of MAGA people, Trump is the start and the end of their interest in politics. And
Right.
they do have a sort of kind of residual distrust of the Republican Party establishment, viewing sort of a lot of, Republican operators, even a lot of, people who are ostensibly loyal to Trump as being, rhinos or people who are only currying favor for Trump because they want something from him. There's a very, very strong distrust of institutions, including the institution of the Republican Party.
Right, right. That charisma, Donald Trump's personal charisma might be the most important factor of the MAGA movement for sure. I think maybe some other features of the MAGA movement that are interesting is nostalgia is one of them. I mean, it's called the Make America Great Again movement, right? So there is this belief by most MAGA adherents that America used to be great. There was a golden era, perhaps it was the 1950s, but whatever it was, America used to be great, but now it's not. And it's not good because of those aforementioned elites, liberals, etc. They have corrupted America. They made it worse. Its economy is worse. Its social values are worse, etc. And I guess that kind of gets into another interesting thing about the MAGA movement. Its base of support. Maybe Jackson, you could touch more on that.
Yeah, MAGA is very interesting because um, compared to the rest of the conservative movement, MAGA is definitely the most like sort of like broad tent and also the most diverse of the different um, sort of conservative factions we mentioned. Part of this definitely is the fact that it's based around Donald Trump personally, and you don't need to
Mhm.
be a specific type of person to like Trump. He can appeal to you for any number of reasons, and because his appeal is so personally based, he can attract a lot of different people as supporters. So while the sort of stereotype of a lot of these other factions is that they're mostly white, they're mostly male. This really isn't as true with MAGA. And so,
Mhm.
you see a lot of different groups of people within it, some even somewhat contradictory, like the Maha like sub movement, which is very much focused on, improving Americans' health. And this is both in sort of a conspiratorial anti-vax sense, but also in a sense of there's a lot of
Mhm.
additives in foods that they want taken out, which is sort of a more regulatory perspective that you might have traditionally seen from Democrats.
Right. That big tent sort of aspect of that movement is arguably one of its greatest strengths, though, despite all of its contradictions, its sub factions that have disagreements with each other. Having this big tent movement around a single person and his beliefs allows these different groups to actually work together. Um, and I think before we go on to the next factions, I think we might want to wrap up MAGA by saying that this is still a hybrid movement. There's a lot of influence from the pre-2015 Republicans. They're still pro free market in many respects, still pro tax cuts, etc. But definitely the MAGA movement marks a nativist or national conservative twist or populist turn for the GOP. Right.
Yeah, and so I think sort of the last big faction that we're going to mention, or sort of big like constellation of maybe smaller factions, is the nativist right. And this term nativist right can be used in like a lot of different ways, but we're kind of using it to describe really the sort of like more like fringe elements of the kind of like modern conservative like right-wing populist movement. And I think sort of within that, let's start like with the most, I guess you could say the most common of the fringe types, which we would say is paleoconservatism, which we mentioned early on in sort of the establishment Republican bit, as this was one of the older factions that had been sort of a subgroup of the old Republican Party that had been in a sort of tense relationship with the Republican establishment. Mohammed, do you want to talk like a little bit more in specifics about like what paleocons are?
Right. We're not going to get into details about the history of this long storied movement, but it's gone under a bit of a resurgence since the MAGA movement Trump has appeared on the scene. Because we said how Trump was animated of a nativist sort of direction, the party, and that has given new life to the paleoconservatives that we had seen under people like Buchanan, but now we're seeing under people like Tucker Carlson. And I think we could describe the worldview as a deeper version of the sort of MAGA worldview. They believe that traditional America is under attack from non-American cultures, ways of life, and values from abroad by, immigrants and foreign cultures, and from within by liberal progressive culture. And this, you might say, it sounds a lot like the MAGA movement, national conservatism, and you'd be right to a great extent. But I would say that the paleocons differentiates in their emphasis on America as under threat from foreign and hostile forces and an Anglo-American, perhaps white American culture. This identitarian view of American society being under threat is unique to paleoconservatism. Other issues like foreign policy minutia or the minutia of economic policy aren't really as important for these people.
Yeah, there's definitely a big, big, big focus on immigration and on culture. And I mean, if we're saying that MAGA is nostalgic, then paleocons, I mean, I'm not even sure what word you could use to describe the level of nostalgia
Living in the past.
and well, that they're on. There really is a broad sort of, though maybe a little less broad nostalgia. They're nostalgic for a lot of very specific parts of old American life. Um, Particularly, and this would probably get some pushback from some paleocons, but maybe not all of them. Particularly an idea of when America was more white. There's definitely a big focus on a sort of spectrum within paleoconservatism on how specific on race issues one might want to get. Some paleocons will insist we don't really have a problem with people of other races, but their cultures need to be sort of adapted into mainstream sort of white Anglo-Saxon culture for them to integrate into this country. Some of the more sort of fringe paleocons will openly say that they don't believe that certain races can exist equally within the United States while the U.S. maintains its own culture.
Right. There is this overriding fear amongst paleocons that differentiates them from the MAGA movement, this focus on culture and belief that there are other cultures infiltrating America that are undermining American cultural values. So they believe that, the principles of Christianity and Anglo-American heritage and et cetera are being undermined by foreign cultures. Perhaps it's Islamic culture or Latin American cultures, or from within, from liberal progressive culture.
Yeah.
And I mean, on specific issues that are maybe important to mention, they're pretty isolationist on foreign policy issues. They don't want to focus on foreign affairs and want to focus on the real battle at home, this culture war that we're talking about. And they are less interested in the minutia of like economic policy or social policy unless it relates to this question of identity and culture.
Yeah, and I mean, even on that isolationist thing, you've seen sort of like gaps emerge between paleocons like Tucker Carlson and other sort of figures on the populist right, especially when it comes to foreign policy. Like Tucker Carlson's been very openly opposed to the current war in Iran.
Right.
He's also been opposed to the war in Iraq and in Afghanistan as well, sort of showing generally the belief among paleocons that foreign wars are a distraction from the real conflict, which is to keep America as it was or return it to its sort of cherished original state.
Right. It's not Iran war, it's the culture war for them. The real enemy is within, they would definitely say. And I think maybe wrapping up Paleocon section, we mentioned how Tucker Carlson is probably the most prominent member of this faction, we could say. And he's definitely led to a resurgence in this faction in the last few years, he along with other people. And in many ways, like MAGA, this movement is quite anti-establishment and quite populist, maybe to some extent conspiratorial. And they would argue that elites and maybe even MAGA elites have been selling out America's culture and sovereignty in favor of globalists and other interests. And I think with that, Jackson, we could probably turn to the most radical faction, the extreme right or white nationalists or Christian nationalists.
Yeah, I mean, if there was some degree of ambiguity over whether paleoconservatives embrace some openly racist talking points, then at this point the ambiguity's been completely thrown out the window. For the extreme right, we're grouping together a lot of sort of smaller groups in this category. Like, we're going to talk about white nationalists, Christian nationalists, and sort of the more extreme, almost like fascist right. Technically, these, you could maybe argue that these are different, but they share a lot of the same similarities to the extent that we feel comfortable sort of talking about them all under one roof. And again, these factions tend to speak a lot less in euphemism and tend to be very explicit on what they believe, which is specifically that white and Christian America is in imminent danger and is potentially doomed from racial minorities, from sort of secularists, or from like Muslims, or from foreign invaders who are sort of trying to replace the traditional white culture of America with a sort of miscegenated foreign culture. Depending on who exactly we're talking about, they might say this is a plot by international like Jews, or that it's a shadowy cabal. That differs depending on who exactly you're talking to, but there very much is a belief that white Christian America is under attack by a foreign enemy and a disloyal element from within, and that radical measures need to be taken in order to stop this invasion and return America to how it was when it was founded.
Right. And I think to add on maybe some gaps there, this faction, this is a faction of what we call a nativist right. But unlike the Paleocons, they are a bit to the right of them. This is maybe a logic, perhaps a evolution from believing that there are other cultures that are incompatible with American way of life to viewing people and races being incompatible with American life, and outright saying that these races don't belong here, people don't belong here, and being quite, as Jackson, straightforward, no using innuendos, which many Paleocons are fond of, and being quite plain and open about saying that there are perhaps liberals or Jews or other races, Muslims, blacks, etc., that are undermining America and need to be put down.
Yeah, one interesting thing is when it comes to their ideas of the governance for America, I think this is one big difference between them and paleocons. Paleocons will generally say that they want to restore America to, an authentic American style of governance, which they usually kind of consider to be like a very extreme form of federalism, a very, very weak central government with states and sort of local cultures being given sort of the maximum amount of breathing room, maybe even to do stuff that, might not be considered legal, such as segregation in the sense of a lot of the older paleocons. But a lot of the people on these really far right things, they don't even like the idea of America being a democracy in any form at all. You'll have Christian nationalists like Douglas Wilson who will advocate for sort of a Protestant theocracy in America. You'll have people like Nick Fuentes who will sort of argue for more of a, like, I guess, traditional like fascist state. But a lot of these sort of different people on the really, really extreme far right do want to make America into a sort of non-democratic state, or they believe that democracy is sort of degenerate and incapable of creating the
Mhm.
America that they want, so they'll replace it with a system that will give it to them.
No, it's for certain. And I think you kind of touched on maybe one aspect of this kind of faction that kind of reveals that this isn't a coherent faction and that there is a hodgepodge of people on the extreme far right. There's white nationalists, people like Doug Wilson, a prominent Calvinist uh, preacher who advocates for eliminating the separation of church and state and making America like a Christian theocracy. Then there are white nationalists, like you probably heard of Nick Fuentes, who advocates for an America that abolishes all immigration and puts other non-white races in subservient positions or worse. So there's a lot of different competing our ideas on the extreme far right for what America should look like. And as Jack said, they're not really within the American tradition of federalism or constitutionalism. They're kind of beyond that. And I think with that, Jackson, especially, you're more of the expert on this extreme far right group. Maybe you could talk a little bit about specific people and ideas and the timeline, perhaps.
Yeah. So traditionally there has been a very, very strong sort of cordon sanitaire between mainstream Republicans and
Mhm.
these really far right elements. The traditional sort of, I guess, story of this is that in the 1960s there was a concerted effort from sort of fusionist Republicans to kick out sort of more like pro KKK elements and sort of the John
Mhm.
Birch Society, which is like a conspiratorial anti-communist group. Sort of, there was a concerted effort to kick them out of the party and to
Mhm.
really, really marginalize them. This is definitely a somewhat true story, but there always has been a degree of influence from the far right onto the mainstream Republicans, sort of laundered through paleoconservatism, maybe.
Mhm.
And you sort of see this increasing impact because a lot of Republican Party talking points, especially now, are kind of, you can see them as sort of watered down versions of ideas that originally came from these extreme groups. A really good example of this is the Great Replacement theory, where
Mhm.
maybe Nick Fuentes will say there is a conspiracy theory, or there's not, he won't say it's a conspiracy theory, though there is a conspiracy by Jews to import non-white people into the United States to destroy American culture and to create a sort of like miscegenated non-white population that's easier for them to control. Then you have paleocons who will maybe take out the Jew part and say, well, globalist elites are, plotting to destroy America by bringing in foreign cultures. Then that gets changed a little more to saying Democrats want immigrants to come in to vote for them in elections so that they can keep winning, which is at this point a fairly mainstream Republican talking point that even Trump
Mhm.
himself has repeated multiple times. And that shows you the increasing sort of focus on entryism into the Republican Party.
Right. I think you did a good you did a really good job explaining all of these different currents and entryism into the Republican Party. I think one thing that I want to add on is how with the MAGA movement, they've gained increasing prominence definitely since 2016 on the fringes of the MAGA movement, increasingly moving into stronger positions. We saw the Charlottesville protest slash riot happen in 2017, and afterwards there was increasing, maybe you could call it infiltration of the GOP. There are many people who claim that there are followers of Nick Fuentes in prominent government positions today, perhaps even in the Trump administration. So we're really seeing this sort of entryism really taking shape from this faction. This faction has to be taken seriously increasingly.
Yeah, the Charlottesville thing is interesting because it marked a very, very big change in the tactics that you see from this group. Because traditionally there had been sort of, a focus on this of the far right as a movement separate from the Republican Party. They sort of believed the Republicans were too compromised to really work within. And
Mhm.
so you saw all these small fringe groups in the sort of more traditional alt-right of like 2016 to 2017. And Charlottesville was sort of the end of that strategy because they tried to create a physical presence out of what had been a traditionally very online movement, and it went very poorly for
Mhm.
them. Turns out open neo-Nazism is probably not a winning strategy in America, at least for right now. And though who knows? But there was increasingly a focus on, okay, well, that was a complete shit show. We got basically all our organizations banned. We like killed a person in public. So we're going to focus on an entryist strategy, sort of infiltrate the Republican Party and make them more amenable to our ideas, sort of using Trump as a springboard to launch ourselves into positions that we might have otherwise been locked outside of.
Yeah. Well, I think with that, we've kind of wrapped up our discussion of the different factions of the right-wing populist area of the American right. And I think from there, we can wrap up this episode and maybe talk briefly about the current landscape and maybe synthesize some of these different strands here. I think I'll start it off by saying it's quite clear. Maybe you've probably already noticed this, but the right libertarian animus from the Tea Party and pro-constitutional sentiment in the early 2010s really on the decline. In fact, maybe it's extinct now, and in its place, a new nativist or national conservative sort of turn has become the dominant sort of strain in the party, as we've seen with the MAGA movement, of course, but also with the paleoconservatives and the extreme far right.
Yeah, there's definitely a sort of increasing belief among the right that it's the libertarianism part of right libertarianism that's increasingly falling out of style. You sort of see, especially among a lot of younger right wingers, this belief that like the situation culturally in America has gotten so bad that just letting people do what they want and assuming that them doing what they want will be them becoming conservative just isn't true anymore. You do sort of see a lot of people, particularly the NatCon side, say, well, the problem with libertarianism is that it assumes that there's a sort of like moral majority in America who, if they just were not being manipulated by liberals anymore, would just naturally become conservatives. But no, maybe a lot of Americans actually are pretty liberal, and that's unacceptable. And so therefore we can't allow that to be a tendency that gets tolerated anymore. So we need to move away from the sort of more libertarian, let people do what they want thing, and move more towards the government's going to have an official stance on culture, and we are going to push it to make sure that people follow it.
Yeah, and that emphasis on taking state power is another it's because of, I guess, many conservatives would say that the libertarian approach allowed liberals and social liberals to take over state institutions and the media and Hollywood and academia, etc. This sort of laissez-faire approach allowed liberals to monopolize the real centers of power, and then they disseminated their liberal, sort of bias, etc., and molded America in a more liberal direction. And that's why they would say, well, we would like to do a more libertarian thing of letting people live as they please, but the other side is taking control of these institutions of power, so we have to take it back.
Exactly. There's a very, very big belief that, you can't trust the liberals to play fair. They're always going to use the media, the institutions, the universities to come after us. So therefore, playing fair on your side is essentially like tying your own hand behind your back in a fist fight. It's just stupid. We need to start playing dirty on our end because they're playing dirty too. If you don't believe this, increasingly they'll call you a rhino or say that you don't understand, where the country's at, or the phrase oftentimes is you don't know what time it is or what hour it is, sort of implying that the hour is late and that to save America, dramatic action needs to be taken.
Right. I think from there we can then discuss maybe briefly some of MAGA's contradictions, perhaps, that people have noted. As we said, there's a big tent movement, and MAGA is the center of the right-wing populist movement, and it has a bunch of different competing ideas in it. I think one of the flashpoints is between more isolationist and more internationalist people. We see this with the current Iran war, where you can see paleocons and more people who more strenuously advocate for national sovereignty don't understand why America is joining Israel in a war that they argue is not in America's interest. And we can see this sort of clash between these two, in isolationist more so and more internationalist sort of parts of the party. And I think we can also extend this to Epstein files, where there's a contradiction, you could argue, between MAGA elites MAGA elites claim that they're trying to drain the swamp, but many people in the base would say they're suspicious of MAGA elites. They think that they have been proven to be just as bad as previous Republican elites, and they aren't, like, say, releasing the Epstein files. And I think the other big tension that I think I wanted to mention is the tension between sort of like the techno capitalist, libertarian, maybe billionaire elites that have increasingly become prominent in the Republican Party. We've seen like, like Elon Musk sort of people versus the more economically nationalist or just simply more like working class sort of impulses in the Republican Party that's skeptical of that kind of elite corporate power.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there's definitely I think definitely sort of a divide in what like MAGA foreign policy is supposed to be. Like just going a little bit off of that, you have some people like some national conservatives even are divided on this. You have people like Stephen Miller who are saying, well, no, America first means it just means we're not in international institutions. We can still do stuff abroad. Like we can attack other countries to show American like
Right.
might. This sort of more, I guess, like Jacksonian foreign policy where you don't want to make treaties, but you're fine with, showing up with gunboats when you think you need to, versus sort of your more Tucker Carlson paleocon things, which is no, when we said America first, we meant we're only focusing on America now. We just don't care about foreign affairs anymore if it doesn't directly affect us.
Right. And I think that now that we've discussed some of these contradictions in the MAGA movement, now that we've also seen over about a year of the second Trump presidency, we can start to ask, like, what is MAGA's future going to be, especially after Trump is gone, and considering all these internal divisions? I think we could ask ourselves, and I'm not going to, provide an answer here. I mean, we don't know for sure, but with Trump gone, there's no central personality to unite all these disparate factions, sub-factions, and no personality to keep, unifying hold over the party. And with him gone, what is the central MAGA institution? Because most MAGA base members don't like the Republican Party, as we said. They think they're full of elites. So what will institutionalize the MAGA movement?
Yeah, that's the problem, isn't it? It's an anti-institutional movement, but to, be a movement that has staying power, you do need to become institutionalized
Right.
in one form or another. I mean, they're just looking across the world, there are a variety of ways that populist movements end, and a lot of it depends on whether they can institutionalize in a way separate from the founder. The ones that last, like Peronism, for example, do create their own parties that last longer than, the sort of lifetime of the guy who founded it. Some of the other ones that perhaps history doesn't remember as much, well, they don't remember it because it fell apart as soon as the leader died. So the big thing is, Trump is very old. He's not in particularly good health as it seems. JD Vance isn't as compelling of a successor as he is. So MAGA is such a personality-based movement that, can it actually stick around after Trump dies? In our episode on MAGA, we're going to go a lot more into depth on this question in terms of speculation on its future. But I think those are just things that we want the audience to think about.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned Vance there, because we can then start asking maybe another question is, what is National Conservatives' relationship with MAGA? Is MAGA a national conservative movement? And with Vance being the VP and seemingly heir apparent to the Republican Party, heir apparent to Trump, will Vance, who's a noted national conservative, move MAGA in a more clearly identifiably national conservative movement? And will he make the party look more like other national conservative parties around the world? I think that will be an interesting question. Will he drop the sort of like maybe more super populist or conspiratorial styling aspects of the MAGA movement, or will he keep some of that as maybe either window dressing or because he genuinely agrees with that? I don't know. It's an interesting question to ask.
I mean, if there's one thing that can be said about JD Vance, is that he is certainly willing to move with the times. In fact, he's willing to move very fast sometimes.
Very quickly.
Very, very quickly. And there definitely is sort of, I think, a ongoing question with that, but it's also linked to sort of the really extreme right that we had been talking about. What's their role going to be in the future of conservatism? I mean, we're seeing them, frankly, reach a level of power and sort of institutional connection that really, I think, is unprecedented. I would say in probably the entire history of the Republican Party as it has existed so far. And there really isn't any sign that this trend is going to stop. In fact, if we do think that MAGA is going to fall on some hard times, or maybe will fracture or
Right.
lose some people after the death of Trump or his marginalization or whatever ends up happening with him, it isn't inconceivable to see, these farther right factions like paleocons and maybe even like white nationalists start to pick up a little bit more steam. I mean, it's definitely interesting to see where that's going to go, because they really are sort of the farthest right fringe of American politics, and them getting this level of power is completely unprecedented.
No, I would totally agree with you, Jackson. I mean, we've seen the nativist and far right people gain prominence or gain increased popularity because of the MAGA movement. They've kind of grown on the sidelines, and with people like Nick Fuentes growing in popularity every day, one has to ask themselves if this trend will continue, especially as it seems the MAGA movement has gotten more radical over time. And I personally, and I will argue this, I do think that if the MAGA movement fractures or loses a bad election, and the Democrats come to power and try to undo, many of their accomplishments, you could see an even more radical reaction as they're outraged by, what they would see as, the Democrats undoing all their good work. And maybe they'll be drawn to a more radical figure, perhaps.
We're gonna see Joker MAGA.
The Joker
Want
movie,
to know how I got this swastika tattoo?
I'm gonna burn it all down. Exactly.
Batman, you're a guy in a black suit who goes around and punches people. There are other people who look like that who also do similar things.
Exactly. No more insinuations, just being straight at. Yeah. Alrighty then. We have concluded our first episode of our right-wing populist series, and I'm happy that we've actually gotten this project off the ground. It's taken us a while.
It took a very long time.
For sure. But we are looking forward to continuing this series on right-wing populism, discussing each of the factions in far greater detail and discussing each of the grievances and particular issues in more detail. So please stay tuned in. We'll be discussing the historical background of right-wing populism and its initial grievances in the next upcoming episodes.
Yes, thank you all so much for listening, wherever you're listening from. And we hope to hear from you and see you again in the future.
Of course. All right. This is Jackson and Muhammad on Winters of Discontent.
Yes.